Hi, welcome to another episode of The Leadership Enigma. The world has gone bonkers. Well, it has done for some time. But we are working with organizations all over the world, and so many of those organizations are working in what I would describe as a global, a flat, and a heavily matrixed way. And with that, we're entering into an increasingly hybrid world too. So as I talk to leaders all around the world, across sectors, levels, and geographies, a topic keeps coming up to the surface, and that is, how do I influence? And how do I influence without authority? That's always been a big topic. So, like all of these wonderful episodes, I need someone way wiser than me. So come back to me after this break. I will be talking to Connson Locke, who will have the answers. Why do I know that? Because also we'll be talking about her wonderful book too, which I'm waving at the camera now. Just come back to me after this short break.
You're listening to The Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
Hi, and it's a big welcome to my guest this week, Connson Locke. Connson, welcome to the Leadership Enigma. How are you?
Thank you, Adam. I'm fine. Thanks for inviting me.
It's been great. Looking forward to this episode, as with all of the episodes. You have a wonderful background, which I'm going to ask you to give some details to the listeners about. You'll do a much better job than I will. But I can just give some highlights there. Professorial Lecturer at the London School of Economics, psychologist, author. We always love an author. Author of Making Your Voice Heard, which I'm waving at you now. And I want to know a little bit about your story, about how you got to this point and why it is that you're focusing on this subject so much, albeit important. But tell us a little bit about your story. What were some of the highlights for you?
Well, I grew up in the States as I'm Chinese American, and I never had a voice, or I felt like I never had a voice. Not in my family, not at school, not at work. You know, I had teachers always saying, Connson, you need to speak up more. You need to speak up more. And I was like, but I can't. I don't know what I have to say. And I worked for quite a long time in many different jobs. I worked in nonprofits for about 6 years when I lived in Boston. And then I moved to Hong Kong and worked in management consulting as a consultant. And then I was training consultants for the Boston Consulting Group. And all of that time, I just really struggled with speaking up, with having influence, you know, with and the more senior I became, the more I felt like, wait, how do I do this? How do I influence things? How do I change things? And then I was asked, when I was at BCG, I was asked to teach a training program for the consultants called Upward Management,
Right.
which was all about getting them to speak up to their bosses. Because in consulting, it's not, the boss doesn't have the answer. The project leader doesn't have the answer. It's the team members who are collecting the data that have the answer. And what these team leaders wanted were team members who would kind of argue with them and say, well, no, that doesn't make sense for the client because I found this. But what they were finding, because we were working in Asia, I was in Hong Kong, and these were all offices across Asia Pacific.
Yep.
The senior people were Western, the junior people were Asian.
Right.
And people were not speaking up. So they were not. And when I was asked to teach this, I was like, oh, I'm not the only one who struggles with this. This is actually a thing. And so when I then went on to decide to do a PhD and move into academia, I thought, this is what I want to look into.
Right.
And so this has just become something that's really interested me for a long time. And I've been teaching it now. I've been at the LSE for 13 years, and I teach it as part of my leadership course.
It is a subject that comes up a lot in the leadership development work that I'm doing. And I'm keen to ask you this. What were some, do you think, of the barriers and challenges that you were facing, and you maybe even hadn't identified when you were younger and growing up? Could you talk a little bit about culture? Was some rooted in family? I don't know, tradition, who knows? But have you looked back and thought, I can see what some of those obstacles were, or what some of those barriers were? What were some of the things that you kind of, now, but maybe hadn't recognized then?
Mm. Well, I think partly it's personality. I'm an introvert,
Okay.
so that's always going to make things a bit more difficult. Um, at least, it's not that introverts don't talk; it's that they oftentimes struggle in a group environment. So they're not
Right.
going to shout over other people. In a one-on-one conversation, it's absolutely fine. The other one is cultural, where and I talk about this in the book. There's a cultural dimension called power distance. And if a culture is high in power distance, that means hierarchy is strong. Hierarchy is respected, and you don't disrespect people who have more power than you. So you don't talk back to your parents. You don't argue with your boss. You just, when your boss says something, you say, "Oh, yes, yes, okay." That's high power distance. And low power distance is obviously the opposite, when you feel maybe I don't think people are ever completely equal, but I have friends who call their parents by their first name, um, or you have a boss who's low power distance. They want to hear from you. They want to know your opinion.
Right.
And so there's this variation in culture that I think also affects this.
Conson, I was doing some work only recently, and I chatted to an amazing guy called Martin Bromley, who was featured in Matt Syed's book, Black Box Thinking, and he is an airline training captain. And this is something, am I right in thinking this is something that has come up in the airline industry, amongst others? And he talked about training for behaviors, and we've seen deference to hierarchy. We've actually seen
Yes.
this mentioned actually after airplane disasters, unfortunately. Is
Yes.
this what we're talking about, where there has been
Absolutely.
a not wearing sunglasses, or a deference to hierarchy of not speaking out to the captain, even though there was an impending tragedy almost
Mhm.
happening? This is what we're talking about, right?
Oh, absolutely. This actually, that piece of research that was one of the first pieces of research I found when I did the PhD. I was like, "Oh my God, this is not only a thing, but
Right.
this actually causes disasters because people aren't speaking up to their bosses."
It's incredible, isn't it, that it's had that kind of impact.
Yeah.
And I know that was also mentioned again. I'm kind of digressing slightly, aren't I? But after Miracle on the Hudson with
Mhm.
Sully Sullenberger, I know that he was a voice, wasn't he, where he was talking about cultural issues and differences, and actually it wasn't about technical ability. The technical ability existed in the operating theatre, or the technical ability was there on the flight deck. It was the behaviour associated to exactly the point that you're making.
Yes. Yeah, it's that idea of, "Oh, wait, should I say something? But will my boss get angry at me? Is it my place to say this?" Yeah.
And so I've got to ask a question as well, because you mentioned it. You said you're the introvert. I'm classically the extrovert. Let me just ask a question that's pandemic related, and then I promise
Mhm.
you I'm not going to focus on the pandemic. What's it been like for an introvert within the pandemic environment and with a completely virtual environment in relation to influence and speaking up and voice? Has it been easier for you, harder for you, or just different?
I so what I like about meetings or group discussions on Zoom is that you have the Zoom hand that you can raise.
Right.
And I love that, because I find it very stressful to have to try to, when you're all in a room together, to try to find the silence in the room, and then you jump in and wait, should I jump in now, or should I, when is it my chance to jump in? Being able to raise the Zoom hand just gives me that structure, and it's like, oh, now I don't have to worry about jumping in.
What would your advice be to leaders as we go back into or we start to move into a hybrid world, or even if we start to go back into a much more face-to-face world? What lesson do you think has come out of the pandemic from this ability for every voice to be heard and every voice to be important, for leaders to take into a post-pandemic environment? What would you say was kind of the number one lesson for them?
Well, I mean, this is the advice that I was giving even before the pandemic, is that as a leader, you need to understand that there is diversity on your team.
Yep.
And so giving team members multiple ways of communicating with you is really useful. So maybe you've just had a brainstorming meeting, but there might be some people who weren't comfortable speaking up in the brainstorming. So then you summarize the meeting in an email, you send out the email and you say, "Hey, give me additional comments in the next 2 days." And so now you're giving people a chance to kind of let it percolate and submit something in writing. And that just includes everyone. But also in the meeting itself, I would say going around and noticing when people aren't speaking up and
Yeah.
asking them what they think.
It's that conversational turn taking, isn't it? And also the psychological safety that is so important. And I know some people have struggled with that in how to create that, enhance that in a hybrid environment or a virtual environment. I'm going to come on to obviously this subject of leading without authority in one moment, but I just want to mention one thing. I'm going to ask you one thing because I think it's absolutely lovely that you really have now a mantra, don't you, for your life at the moment, and it's be a light, not a judge. And just explain a little bit about that, because I just think that's a wonderful insight into you.
Well, when I turned 50, I'm 56 now, and when I turned 50,
You
I
do
really
not
kind of,
look 56, Connson. Am I allowed to say that? You do not.
you know, this is the thing is I don't mind telling people how old I am because I know I don't look it.
You really don't.
Thank you. But so I actually kind of freaked out because I was like, oh my God, I'm closer to death than birth. I'm like halfway through my life. Ah. And I thought, okay, I need to have some sort of mission. I need to have something that defines this second half of my life. And I happened upon that. I think it was Stephen Covey that said, be a light, not a judge. And it really struck me because I think of leadership as my metaphor for leadership is not the military general or the sports coach. It's actually a candle,
Okay.
because I think of a leader as a light, someone who's lighting the way, and maybe warming people as well. So it's a combination of things. And I had spent most of my younger life being very judgy, not just judging other people, but judging myself. And that's why I stifled my own voice. It was like, well, that's not important. Why should you say that? You have nothing to contribute. And I thought, I'm done with that. Life is too short. I'm
Yeah.
going to be a light. I'm going to help people. I'm going to light the way for them. And I'm going to stop judging others as well as myself.
And how's it going?
It's hard, but it's getting easier. I actually got challenged the other day where someone said to me, yes, but then how do you improve if you're not judging? And what I want to point out here is there's a difference between analyzing and judging.
Yeah.
Judging has a emotional connotation. When you judge, you're saying, oh, you're good or you're bad. When
Right.
you're analyzing, you're saying, I could have done that better. Okay, let me do that better.
It,
And I think we can analyze without that judging component.
it's almost getting rid of that inner critic, isn't it? And actually
Yes.
being, I did a wonderful episode actually with Lee Evans last week, so it really resonates, where he said, for Lord's sake, he said, be kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Just give it a break,
Yep.
and be grateful, and you're going to get things wrong. And as you say, don't judge it, but how could you have done it better? And what do you need to learn for the next time? But just get rid of that inner critic. And I think that's so hard, isn't it? Or especially people who are high performing. Think about the roles that you've had, the firms that you've worked for, the job that you have right now. It's hard, isn't it, to actually think, oh my God, that, what have I done? Why have I done that?
Hmm. It is hard, but the more you practice it, and I've had 6 years now to practice it, it does get easier because it's what you're doing is you're taking the emotional component out of it. And you're just being objective and saying, well, that could have been done better. And here's how we could have done it better. And it's so much easier when you take the emotion out. You just go,
Yeah.
oh, okay, rather than going, oh, I'm terrible. I'm a horrible person. Why did I do that?
It's so human nature, isn't it, as well, for us to do that. But we have to catch ourselves in the act, don't we? And in some ways, just rewire ourselves.
Yeah. And the thing is, if we do that for ourselves, we do it for other people as well. And it makes us a better leader because you're not judging your team members. You're just saying, actually, you could have done that better. Why don't you do it this way? Rather than saying, oh, you're terrible. Oh.
Well, I like that in itself. I think there's almost a second title to this episode, and that's "Be a Light, Not a Judge." So I think that's a good takeaway point. So let's focus on really the subject matter of this episode now, and that's influence and influence without authority. Can you just give us a little bit of an overview of your thoughts about what is influence? It's used all the time. The trial lawyer in me was taught in relation to how can one influence and persuade and communicate with judge and jury, but we are influencing all the time. I'm disastrous when it comes to my teenagers, but that's another story. But what are your thoughts? What is influence when we look at it holistically?
Influence is the ability to change someone else's behavior or attitude.
Right.
So influence can actually be measured. Like you can see how much influence someone has, because what you're trying to do with influence is you're trying to change something. So how much did you change it? That's influence.
Gotcha. Okay. And when we talk about the importance of influence without authority, why has that become such a theme within leadership? Is it because the world has changed on a dime because of the the pandemic, or is it because we are working on much more matrix now, non-hierarchical firms? I don't know. What are your thoughts in relation to that? Why does this keep floating to the surface? The ability to influence without authority from top to bottom.
Well, the reason I actually think it's always been important, and the reason I find it important, I actually noticed a long time ago when I was at BCG. We had a lot of project leaders running projects, and a lot of their teams were burnt out and not happy. But there was this one project leader who was doing a really good job.
Okay.
And the story went around that one day he was in a team meeting with his team, and the vice president came by who was running that project. And the vice president came in and said, I just had a meeting with the client, and we need to do this, 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 and this. And the team leader, instead of saying, oh, yes, okay, like all the other team leaders did, said, wait, hold on. We're working on this right now. If you want us to work on that as well, we've got to reprioritize. And the team were like, you just said no to the boss. Oh my God, he's going to get fired.
Yeah.
And what happened was the vice president was like, oh, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Okay, let's sit down and talk about this. And it brought home to me that the way to be a good leader is you've got to push up as well as down.
Truth
So
to power.
You're not just this idea of leading without authority. So that's what made me interested in what I call upward influence. So you're influencing up the hierarchy in order to protect your team, in order to run a better team, in order for the team not to burn out. And so I include this whenever I teach leadership. I include this, and that's what the book is all about, is that upward influence. And essentially that's what you could call leading without authority.
Okay, upward influence, because there are so many things I'm sure that ingredients there. One is sometimes maybe just to have the courage, as you say. Everyone took a step back and thought, oh my word, you've just done, did you really do that? Did you say that out loud? Mm-hmm. So there is a courageous element to it. Also, there was a humility piece of the leader, wasn't there, to actually say, actually, on reflection, you're right. There's that psychological safety element. So many critical ingredients. But I want to, there is a part of your book that I want you to talk us through, because you talk about the face you show the world. Mm. And this also dovetails into another conversation that I have with leaders who say one must be authentic. And I say, but there's authenticity in context, because what you might be in one culture may not be acceptable in another culture. But there's still a way of being authentic, respectful, in context. Tell me a little bit about this then, the face that we show the world. What is that face that we show the world?
So I'm glad you brought this up, because I think a lot of people misunderstand authenticity.
Yes, agreed.
So the metaphor I use for authenticity is, think of a metal ball inside a rubber ball, inside a larger rubber ball. So the metal ball is your core. Those are your principles, the way you want to live your life, your goals. The rubber ball is the face you show the world.
Right.
And it's malleable. It can adjust depending on your context and who you're dealing with. So the example I often use is, one of my core principles is I help people learn and grow. But if I'm doing that with my boss versus a PhD student, I'm going to behave in a very different way. With my boss, I'm going to use a different tone of voice, a different approach, different words, everything's going to be different. With the PhD student, I'm going to be much more direct. And, so it makes sense when you think about it that I'm not behaving exactly the same in those two situations, but I'm still being authentic, because my goal in both situations is to help the person learn and grow.
See, Connson, I love this, because we're singing off the same hymn sheet. But why are we hearing this from some people say, listen, be true to who you are. If you do it like this, then you do it like this. And people will have to just suck it up and deal with it. And I'm mildly horrified by that, but I keep hearing it.
So there's actually a personality difference here.
Okay.
There's a personality trait called self-monitoring.
Right.
And self-monitoring, you can be a high or a low self-monitor. And, there's a whole range, obviously. But someone who's a high self-monitor, sometimes they're called a chameleon. They're
Right.
very sensitive to the situation around them, and they easily adjust. You probably know people like this, where after they've been talking to you for a while, their cadence starts to match your own
Yes.
cadence,
There's
or
a
their accent
mirroring that
starts to
happens.
match. Yeah, exactly. But they're doing it subconsciously. They're just a very high self-monitor. And there are other people that are at the lower end of self-monitoring, where they're like, but this is who I am. This is the way I've always been. I can't be any different. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so there is a personality difference here. And I suspect that some of those people are low self-monitors.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because if I think about top of house CEOs, we both, I'm sure, met a number of CEOs, some may fall into the high self-monitoring category and some may fall into the low self-monitoring category. And I'd love to know, there must be some research in relation to what that does to the organization, to the culture, to the values within the organization. I don't know any. Have you got any thoughts on that? Have you seen
Well,
anything anecdotally on it?
I mean, the research on self-monitoring mostly looks at, is it good or bad to be a self-monitor?
Right.
And a lot of the research has shown that being I don't know, when they say high self-monitor, I don't think they mean extreme. Like, it's just someone who can adjust more
Yeah.
easily, tends to be a good thing,
Right.
because you can adapt to different cultures, you can adapt to different environments. And so it is a good thing if you can be on the higher side of self-monitoring.
Right.
I think what it would do, I mean, I haven't seen any research about how it would affect an organization, but what I suspect is a leader who's a high self-monitor. Now, this is assuming they have sincerity. So assuming they
Right.
have that
Yes.
metal ball in the center that are their principles and their driving principles. If you don't have
Gotcha.
that metal ball, then forget it. You're just like an empty whatever.
Yes.
So assuming they have sincerity and those driving principles, I think it would be really good for an organization, because people will feel understood. They'll feel heard. They'll feel like this person gets me, because they're kind of adjusting to what this particular person needs or what this situation requires.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, music to my ears as you describe it that way. And I love the analogy, by the way, of the metal ball within the rubber ball. With your permission, I must use that. I think that's a
Sure.
great way of explaining it, and say, I had this great conversation with Connson. I now know how to explain this to you. So when we're thinking about self-monitoring, I pulled us off slightly, but we're thinking about that in relation to the face we show the world and our ability to be reflective and to change as necessary. Yes?
Exactly. And so the face you show the world is, I mean, it's stuff you learn in presentation skills training, how to look confident, how to
Yes.
sound confident. But it's also things like, so Cialdini wrote a great book on influence
Yes.
that's based on what marketers do, telemarketers and salespeople. So it's all about, how do you sell someone something? So it's how do you phrase things? What are the words that you use? And all of that is what I consider the surface stuff. The
Right.
face you show the world, the tools that you can use in the moment. But for me, and what I write about in the book is there are two other layers here. There's a foundational layer, which is your inner self. You
Yes.
have to have those principles. You have to have the confidence to use those tools. But there's also that larger context, which is the cultural context. So you have to understand, what is the organizational culture or the larger culture that I'm influencing in, and adjust my behavior in that way. And I
Great.
think that's what a lot of other books on influence are missing, is the
Right.
inner self and the cultural context.
Right. Well, you set me up wonderfully then for those two stages, I think, because now that we've spoken about the face that you show the world, let's talk a little bit about then the inner self. So what are your thoughts to anyone who's listening, really? Because when I talk about leaders and leadership, I'm talking about anything from maybe, yes, senior executives, right through to people who are just starting out, because they're understanding how to lead themselves before they go on to lead a small team and maybe an organization that goes on to do incredible things and be a real force for good. So what are we talking about when we talk about the kind of the inner context or the inner self?
The inner self, I think, is often neglected, but it's what I've found, And honestly, I've said to people, I don't think I could have written this book before the age of 50, because
Right.
it's taken me this long to kind of figure out my inner self. And so that's what I've put in the book, are the things that helped me. But it's more than just confidence. It's actually knowing who you are. Like, what am I here to do? Like, what is important to me? How should I be prioritizing things? What kind of job should I be taking? And is this the right role for me? And am I doing what I should be doing in this life? Like,
Those are important questions, aren't
yeah.
they? Do
And we
you think
don't
the
ask
pandemic?
it.
I know. Do you think the pandemic has heightened people reflecting on those kinds of questions because of in some way that they
Yes.
had a time to pause? Because I'm hearing people ask those kinds of questions. I just wonder if you have too.
Yeah. And I'm really encouraged by that. So
Yeah.
I've been asking myself, what is the meaning of life, since I was about 15. But so
When you
I'm
find
really
out, please tell me and come on the show.
I think the meaning of life is what you make of it.
Right.
It's really to figure out what is your contribution to the world, and following that. So that it's taken me this long to figure out my contribution, which is to help people learn and to, help give people their voice. But I am very encouraged by the fact that I think the pandemic has made more and more people wonder about that, because I
So,
think that's the first step.
yeah, no, I agree. And sometimes we neglect, don't we, ourselves, and we focus more outwardly. So, thoughts, any advice to our listeners in relation to let's never waste a good crisis as we come through and out of this pandemic? What should we start to do or start to think about in relation to ourself and our power or ability to influence?
Well, okay, the first thing, if we're
Yeah.
going to talk about the pandemic, is I think we need more joy in our lives,
Oh,
because
yes,
the pandemic has worn us down, really worn us down.
that's so true.
And I think the first thing we need to do is really think about what makes us happy, and when I say happy, I'm not talking about like passive happiness, like, oh, drinking a bottle of wine. I'm
That
talking
helps
about which,
sometimes.
okay, there is a time and a place for that. But
Yeah, another episode.
exactly. But I'm talking about things like taking a walk through the
Yeah,
woods. I mean, it's autumn right now. Go outside and shuffle through the leaves. They're
yeah.
beautiful. It's looking up at the sky. It's if you have any um, artistic interests, it's like doing a painting. You don't have to show anyone the painting, but just do it. Or playing a piece of music, or it's just getting in touch with the beauty in the world, to kind of lift our spirits a bit.
Is this a
And the
bit of
more
being
we can,
kind to yourself again, Conson?
yeah, but it's not just that, it's more than that, because if you lift your spirits as a leader, your emotions and energy are contagious. So you need to take care of yourself. It's like on the airplane where they say, when the oxygen mask drops down, put it on yourself first before you take care of your kids.
Right.
It's like you need to take care of your own energy and joy and emotions before you can take care of others.
Do you think there's any link as well? Because we're hearing about the great attrition, aren't we? And I am hearing from firms
Mhm.
that they are suffering significant talent loss.
Yes.
People are, do you think this is linked as well, where people are reflecting and thinking, what makes me happy? Actually, this does not. Goodbye.
Yeah. No, I think so, but there's so many different reasons. Like
Yeah.
we're experiencing it at the LSE, just on the program that I'm working. We've had a lot of resignations, but for one person, it's because she lives outside of London and she used to commute into London all the time. But during the
Yep.
pandemic, she was working from home, and she's like, wait a minute, I don't want to commute all the way into London anymore. So that was one reason. For another person, it's because we were short staffed during the whole pandemic, and he was completely burnt out. And he's like, I just can't go on anymore. I've got to quit and just, get myself back together. And for another person, it was because it's like a new opportunity came up and I really don't like what I'm doing. So I think there are many different reasons, but I'm definitely seeing that effect.
Do you think that's led me probably neatly into the next thing? Do you think that then is about to change the social context, which you also talk about in your book, and culture, which we spoke about at the start? And as you say, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Do you think that context is set to change as well?
I think there's a lot of change happening. And just to be clear, the chapter is men are not from Mars and women are not from
Ah,
Venus.
thank you. Right.
Because the point I'm trying to make is that men and women are raised in different subcultures. So we
Right.
have a male subculture, a female subculture, because boys and girls, they're socialized separately and they learn different ways of communicating and different ways of being with each other. And so once we grow up and we are interacting with each other, it's cross-cultural communication.
Okay.
It's not interplanetary communication. So everything you know about how to deal with a different culture applies to dealing with the other sex.
Right. Now let's focus a little bit more on this, because some of the most successful leaders that I've met are ones that have had secondments and had placements in completely different cultures, and they've had the courage to pick up the family and move
Yep.
across the world. And there is something about them, I think, which is high self-monitoring in order to be able to adapt in
Yep.
those. So help me and help any listeners here in relation to the importance and their ability to really understand different cultures and understand this challenge of influencing up, down, and sideways.
Mm. Well, so this actually takes me back to the inner self bit, because I
Okay.
saw a Harvard Business Review article recently. Well, it was written quite a while ago, but a student sent it to me recently about how if you live in a different culture for a while, if you live overseas for a while, you get to know yourself better.
Okay. Tell me more.
Because and it makes sense, because you're put in a culture where people are doing things differently from the way you're used to doing them at home. And so you now have to struggle a bit with, oh, wait, can I do things differently? Wait, is this really part of my core, or is this something I can change? And so you end up getting to know yourself. So I think that's part of it.
I love
Leaders
that.
who have worked in a different culture, they get to know themselves better, and their core principles, that metal ball becomes clearer to them, so that they can now move on in a way where they've got that combination of a clear purpose and set of principles, but an adaptability, an ability to adjust in their way of communicating or their way of behaving based on the culture.
And you've had that experience, haven't you, Connson? Because
Mhm.
I know you've worked across and lived in multiple countries. So have you seen that true in you, that you've been challenged by being in different
Yes.
cultures, and that's asked you to look internally?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. When I first moved to Hong Kong, so I actually, my parents moved, I grew up in the States, and
Uh-huh.
my parents moved to Hong Kong when I was 14. So I went to high school in Hong Kong. But being a teenager, I refused to accept the fact that I was living in Hong Kong. So I
Right.
walked around really angry at my parents and grumpy all the time, thinking, this is a bad dream. This is a bad dream. I'm going to go home soon. And then so when I graduated from high school, I went back to the States for university. But then when I was about 27, I decided to go back to Hong Kong. And
Right.
that was my choice. And so that was a very different experience. And what I found was it's a really difficult. So there's a quote. Khalil Gibran wrote this book called The Prophet, and I love this quote because the older I get, the more I understand it. It's, your pain is the breaking of the shell that contains your understanding.
Okay.
And I never understood it until I really went through that pain. And when I moved to Hong Kong at the age of 27, I was in so much pain. I was like, I don't know anyone here. Everything's different. Why did I do this? I'm stupid. I should have moved back. I actually threw away my journals from that time of my life because I found them recently and they were so pathetic. All I was doing was complaining and crying to myself and feeling sorry for myself. I threw them away because I was like, I don't want to look at them again.
Right.
But that was how difficult that period of time was for me. But this is one thing I've learned about myself, because I went through the same thing when I then decided to do a PhD. It's like, oh, why did I do this? I don't know anything. I'm surrounded by people who are smarter than me. This was so stupid. So this is what I've realized about myself. When I decide to make a big change in my life, I regret the change immediately after I've made it.
Right.
But if I can just get over that, then it's wonderful. Then I grow. But that's the pain. That's the breaking of the shell of my understanding. I just have to go through that pain. And then it's like, I'm a different person now. I've learned about myself. I've got all these new skills and knowledge. Yeah.
And is that part and parcel of, obviously you talk about in your book about creating positive change as well.
Mm,
Is that part of your experience that you've had to go through that pain in order to understand that you're creating positive change for yourself and those around you?
absolutely. Absolutely. And what pushes me to create the change, because you might be like, well, why did you go through that pain then? But it's because I get bored. I get bored and I'm like, I'm stagnating. What am I doing with my life? So then that's why I decide to make the change. But it's only after I've made the change that I go, why did I just decide to shake up my whole life and leave everything behind? And
Here
this
we
is
go
really
again.
horrible. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah, I've done
exactly.
that a few times. And I do consider something, I look back and think, was I mad when I did
Hmm.
that, when I left that to do that? But actually, I also agree with you. And it's been quite heartwarming to hear that it takes a lot of time, doesn't it, for us to start to really understand our self-worth, what actually makes us happy, what are we doing with our lives. I always used to joke for so many years, I've still got no idea what I want to do when I grow up.
Hmm.
And then that used to become quite a frustration because I thought, and this was many years ago, I thought I really should have had this sorted by now, but maybe not. Maybe I'm still on that journey.
Yeah.
But let me, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and this is wonderful to have this conversation. And I hope the listeners as well are thriving and thinking now, how do I get in contact with Connson, which I'll ask you in a moment. But for anyone listening to this who is leading self, leading others, leading an organization, small, medium, or large, we can't solve all of their issues in relation to leading without authority, but we can get them started. So
Hmm.
what would be your kind of your top tips or get people on the journey to understanding and being better at leading without authority in a world that is slightly bonkers?
Mm. I think one of my top tips is pick your battles.
Right.
And this is where knowing yourself and your principles and your priorities becomes really important. Pick your battles, because influence, especially leading with authority, is hard.
Yeah.
And it's really only worth it when when it's worth it. So it's not about making your voice heard about everything. It's making your voice heard about those things that are really important.
Yeah, that
And then
matter.
once you pick your battles, be patient. Timing is everything. I've had changes that I've tried to make that took me 2 years in the end,
Right.
because I knew that the right people weren't in place or it wasn't the right time for the organization. But if it's important enough, it's worth waiting for, and it's worth trying and trying. So those I think are the two big things.
Great advice. Pick your battles and be patient. And perhaps we get better at those as we get older. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that's the case. So how can people get hold of you, Connson, to continue the conversation? Have you become involved in their journey? What's the best way?
Well, you can connect with me on LinkedIn,
Yes.
just Connson Locke on LinkedIn. And I also have a website, which is consonlocke.com. And there's lots of information there. There's also articles and videos that I've put on there, resources for people.
Yeah, I saw that. I had that pulled up on my laptop early this morning as well. And let's also talk a little bit about, because they can get a copy of Making Your Voice Heard. So I'm waving. Come on, Connson, you've got your own
Yes.
copy there, haven't you? Wave that
Here
back
you
at me. There
go.
you go. That's what I want. So tell them a little bit about where they can get this.
Amazon or any major bookstore. It's if you go to my website, there are links to all the retailers where you can get it all around the world.
Great. And have you seen it in a bookstore?
Every time I walk into a bookstore, I ask about my book and I can't find it. So then I email my publisher and I'm like, why isn't my book in this bookstore that I walked into? And they're like, oh, well, they do have it somewhere. So
Oh, I asked the question because I had my book published last year and I kept looking for it in a bookstore and then being utterly disappointed not be able to find
yeah,
it.
so
But it's on
same as
Amazon.
me.
You want to see a hard copy. You want to see it.
Exactly.
So I'm glad that's kind of authors sharing pain now.
I know. It makes me feel a bit better too.
This has now been therapeutic in many
Yes.
ways. Brilliant. I'm now going to ask you my final question, maybe slightly unfair. With all of the work that you do and all of the wisdom that you have and all of the questions that you're still asking, which is so refreshing, is there a piece of leadership advice that is front of mind for you that you've given or received that just stands out as a gem?
Yes. I think I'm going to go back to Stephen Covey again.
Right.
It's seek first to understand before being understood. And I think that is critical to everything, because we go in, especially with influence, we go in thinking, I know what's best here. I'm going to try to convince the other person without first really understanding what is that other person's perspective.
Yeah.
And the more you can do that first, the more influential you will be in the end.
I love that as well. There's a great, there's a short video out there, Simon Sinek, about leaders talking last, not first, when it actually comes to a meeting of whatever important.
Exactly.
Connson, this has been fabulous. Time has flown by, and I could chat to you for hours, which would be incredibly unfair. But I just want to say a massive thank you. I hope you've enjoyed being a guest on the Leadership Enigma, and if you'll consider coming back to us and continuing the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adam. This was really fun.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.